Spring 1943. Above the churning North Sea and the scarred landscapes of occupied Europe, a new, formidable adversary began to dominate the skies, the American 8th Air Force. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, accustomed to a certain aerial supremacy, the initial encounters with the Boeing B-17 flying fortress were nothing short of a profound shock. Imagine a young Oberleutnant in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109G, peeling off from his squadron, banking hard into the sun. His target, not a single vulnerable bomber, but a vast, disciplined formation of four-engined giants, glinting like 1,000 polished daggers against the azure. These were the American heavy bombers, and they flew in tightly packed combat boxes, each a self-contained bastion of defensive firepower. They looked like an armored fist, one German pilot later recounted, unyielding and seemingly impervious. The sheer scale of these formations, sometimes stretching for miles, was an intimidating sight in itself. But it was their defensive capability that truly stunned the German interceptors. From every angle, nose, tail, belly, dorsal, and waist, the B-17s bristled with .50 caliber machine guns. When a dozen, 2 dozen, or even more of these aircraft flew in unison, their combined arcs of fire created an impenetrable wall of lead, a defensive matrix that few single-engine fighters could hope to breach unscathed. Attempting to penetrate this formidable array was an exercise in suicidal bravery, frequently resulting in catastrophic losses for the attacking Staffeln. German pilots, honed by years of combat, found their usual tactics of swift, decisive passes rendered ineffective. Head-on attacks, designed to exploit the B-17's initial lack of forward-firing armament, were met with increasingly effective nose gunnery, a brutal baptism by fire. Flank attacks were shredded by coordinated waist gunners. From the German perspective, these flying fortresses lived up to their name with chilling efficiency. They seemed to possess an almost mythical invincibility, absorbing damage that would cripple any other aircraft, yet continuing their relentless push towards their targets. The challenge was clear. If the Luftwaffe wished to stem the tide of strategic bombing, they would need to adapt, innovate, and exploit even the most subtle vulnerabilities of this aerial behemoth. The B-17's inherent robustness was but one facet of its formidable defense. What truly amplified its lethality was the meticulously choreographed aerial ballet known as the combat box formation. This wasn't merely a grouping of aircraft, it was a self-supporting ecosystem of firepower. Each bomber was positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, creating a dense, three-dimensional curtain of defensive machine gun rounds. A typical combat box, comprising anywhere from 18 to 36 B-17s, could unleash hundreds of .50 rounds per second against any aggressor. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, tasked with interdicting these bomber streams, the combat box presented an almost insurmountable tactical problem. Traditional fighter attack patterns, whether stern approaches or beam attacks, often meant flying directly into a concentrated barrage from multiple aircraft. The sheer volume of defensive fire made close-range engagements perilous, and distant attacks proved ineffective against the B-17's sturdy airframe. Luftwaffe records from late 1942 and early 1943 paint a stark picture of escalating attrition. German fighter pilots, accustomed to engaging more lightly armed British bombers or single-engined adversaries, found themselves confronting an airborne porcupine. Ace pilot Günter Rall, reflecting on these early encounters, described the experience as flying into a hail of steel. Attempts to break formation through sustained attacks often resulted in heavy losses for the interceptors, with German fighters being shredded by the ubiquitous .50 rounds long before they could inflict decisive damage on the bombers. The cost, both in experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft, was becoming strategically unsustainable. The tactical imperative was clear and pressing. The Luftwaffe could not continue to absorb such disproportionate losses. A paradigm shift in interception strategy was not merely desirable, it was an operational necessity if they were to effectively challenge the 8th Air Force's relentless daylight bombing campaign. The question was not if they needed to adapt, but how they could exploit even the most minute vulnerabilities within this seemingly impregnable aerial fortress. Faced with the formidable, unyielding flying fortresses and their interlocking fields of fire, The initial shock within the Luftwaffe soon gave way to a tactical imperative for innovation. German fighter units, understanding that conventional rear attacks were proving prohibitively costly, began to rethink their entire interception doctrine. One of the earliest and most audacious adaptations was the head-on attack. Recognizing the B-17's primary defensive weakness lay in its forward arc, particularly before the widespread adoption of the Chin turret, German pilots, often flying Focke-Wulf FW-190s or Messerschmitt Bf-109s, would approach the bomber formations from directly ahead. The closing speed of two aircraft, each traveling at over 300 miles per hour, created a terrifyingly brief engagement window, demanding pinpoint accuracy and nerves of steel. A direct hit, even from a 20mm cannon, could be catastrophic for the bomber's cockpit and flight crew. This tactic, though highly dangerous for the attacking fighter, often proved devastatingly effective, scattering formations and creating openings for follow-up passes. As the air war intensified, technological solutions complemented tactical shifts. The introduction of the R4M rocket, a simple yet potent unguided air-to-air missile, provided a means to engage the bomber streams from a safer distance. Launched in salvos from beyond the effective range of the B-17's defensive guns, these rockets could rip through the tightly packed formations, causing critical damage and, crucially, disrupting the protective combat box integrity. A single hit from an R4M could down a bomber, but its primary utility was to force the formation to break, leaving individual aircraft vulnerable to conventional gun attacks. The ultimate expression of this evolving, brutal approach came with the development of the Sturmgruppe formations. These specialized fighter units, often flying heavily armored FW-190s, were designed as aerial battering rams. Stripped of external ordnance to enhance maneuverability, these aircraft were fitted with additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine, and armed with an array of devastating weaponry, typically 4 20mm cannons in the wings and 2 powerful 30mm Mk108 cannons in the fuselage. Their mission was uncompromising: to punch directly through the bomber formations, often targeting the lead aircraft, to shatter the cohesion and command structure of the American daylight raids. These were not dueling aircraft, they were flying tanks, sacrificing speed and agility for sheer destructive power and survivability against defensive fire. The Sturmgruppe represented a desperate yet highly effective attempt to counter the B-17's inherent strengths through overwhelming, concentrated force. The Sturmgruppe proved a brutal, if desperate, answer to the B-17's inherent resilience. Yet, even as Luftwaffe units honed these devastating tactics, a new, deeply perplexing phenomenon began to emerge in the Allied bomber streams, one that initially defied immediate tactical classification. Initial intelligence reports from forward observation posts and aerial reconnaissance assets quickly converged on a peculiar development. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, already accustomed to the standard B-17 configuration, found themselves confronted by a variant that was visually distinct and tactically ambiguous. This was no ordinary flying fortress. Its bomb bay doors were conspicuously absent, often sealed or replaced with additional fuel tanks, a clear indicator that its primary mission was not payload delivery. Far more alarming was the radical augmentation of its defensive armament. Where a typical B-17 bristled with 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, these new variants appeared to mount upwards of 16, sometimes even 18 weapons. Pilots reported additional chin turrets, staggered waist gun positions, and an enhanced tail emplacement, transforming an already heavily armed bomber into an airborne porcupine. Luftwaffe tactical analysts at Reichsluftfahrtministerium swiftly pieced together the fragments. This was the YD-40, an experimental fortress escort, essentially a B-17 stripped of its bombing capability and laden with additional armor and firepower. The intent was clear: to provide a self-defending, long-range escort for the conventional bomber formations, filling the critical gap left by the limited operational range of Allied fighter aircraft at that stage of the war. Initial German reactions ranged from wary respect to outright apprehension. Had the Americans found a way to create an unassailable bomber formation? Would these flying destroyers render existing anti-bomber tactics obsolete, negating the hard-won lessons against the B-17? Luftwaffe Command issued directives for extreme caution, urging pilots to observe these new adversaries meticulously, to probe for weaknesses rather than commit to their established, often costly attack profiles. The sky had just become a far more complex and dangerous arena. The air over occupied France in the spring of 1943 witnessed a brutal tactical evolution. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, hardened veterans of the air war, had by this point developed a grim familiarity with the American B-17 Flying Fortress. They understood its strengths, its weaknesses, and the optimal vectors for their attack runs. But on May 19, 1943, during a raid targeting U-boat pens at Lorient, elements of Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-26, encountered a new, more menacing variant within the bomber stream. These were the YB-40 Flying Fortresses, a heavily armed escort designed to bolster the defensive firepower of the bomber formations. Initial reports from returning pilots were stark. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Lange, a Staffelkapitän with over 40 confirmed victories, noted in his debriefing, these were not ordinary forts. Their forward armament was unprecedented. A head-on pass was suicide. It was like flying into a storm of lead. The most immediate and striking change observed by the German pilots was the formidable increase in frontal firepower. The addition of the Bendix chin turret, housing twin .50 caliber machine guns, fundamentally altered the calculus of a frontal assault. Where a head-on pass against a standard B-17 might have offered a brief window of vulnerability, the YB-40 transformed this into a deadly gauntlet. Pilots attempting their customary frontal quarter attacks found themselves directly in the cone of fire from these new turrets, combined with the existing nose and cockpit guns. The volume of incoming projectiles was devastating. Furthermore, the YB-40s often sported additional waist guns and a modified tail turret, presenting a denser defensive screen from all angles. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, who had meticulously refined their tactics to exploit perceived gaps in the B-17's coverage, now found those gaps significantly narrowed, if not entirely eliminated, by the sheer proliferation of defensive weaponry. Early engagements were characterized by a palpable sense of frustration and, critically, increased losses for the attacking German fighters. The YB-40s, while noticeably slower due to their substantial additional weight and armament, proved exceptionally difficult to approach and engage effectively. Pilots were frequently forced to break off attacks earlier, often before achieving a solid firing solution under the relentless torrent of .50 caliber fire. Furthermore, the YB-40s often sported additional waist guns and a modified tail turret, presenting a denser defensive screen from all angles. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, who had meticulously refined their tactics to exploit perceived gaps in the B-17's coverage, now found those gaps significantly narrowed, if not entirely eliminated, by the sheer proliferation of defensive weaponry. Early engagements were characterized by a palpable sense of frustration and, critically, increased losses for the attacking German fighters. The YB-40s, while noticeably slower due to their substantial additional weight and armament, proved exceptionally difficult to approach and engage effectively. Pilots were frequently forced to break off attacks earlier, often before achieving a solid firing solution under the relentless torrent of .50 caliber fire. These initial, often brutal encounters triggered an urgent tactical reassessment within the Luftwaffe High Command. Intelligence sections immediately began dissecting combat reports, analyzing gun camera footage, and interviewing returning pilots to understand the full implications of this new adversary. The prevailing wisdom regarding bomber engagement strategies had been profoundly challenged. A new approach was required, one that went beyond simply avoiding the YB-40s and instead sought to understand and, ultimately, exploit their newly perceived strengths, which inevitably masked deeper vulnerabilities. The initial encounters with the YB-40s had indeed presented the Luftwaffe with a perplexing tactical conundrum. Yet the German High Command, ever pragmatic in the face of evolving threats, had mandated a shift from mere avoidance to meticulous analysis. They sought the deeper vulnerabilities, and it was through the crucible of repeated combat engagements that these began to manifest. Luftwaffe pilots, particularly those operating the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, were directed to scrutinize the behavior of these heavily armed B-17 variants. What emerged from this relentless observation was a critical pattern, a flaw so fundamental it would irrevocably alter the YB-40's operational doctrine and seal its fate. It became glaringly apparent that while the YB-40s could maintain formation with the main bomber stream during the inbound leg of a mission, their performance diverged dramatically at a pivotal moment, after the primary bombing group had released its ordnance. As the standard B-17s, now unburdened by their bomb loads, accelerated and climbed with renewed agility, the YB-40s struggled. Their additional armor plating, heavier armament, and extra ammunition, components that offered their perceived strength, transformed into an operational albatross. The fundamental physics of flight dictated that the YB-40, with its significantly increased gross weight and identical engine configuration to a standard B-17, could simply not match the sustained speed or altitude of its lighter counterparts post-bomb release. This discrepancy meant that as the main bomber formations, now faster and more maneuverable, began their return leg, the YB-40s inevitably lagged behind. They became isolated outliers, progressively falling out of the protective embrace of the main formation's defensive fire. This critical performance differential was their Achilles heel, an inescapable consequence of their very design philosophy. The German tactical analysts at the Reich's Luftfahrtministerium quickly seized upon this observation. A new directive was disseminated across fighter wings. Do not engage the YB-40s directly until the main bomber force has completed its attack run. Instead, conserve ammunition and fuel, shadowing the formations with patient aggression. Once the bomb bays emptied and the conventional B-17s surged forward, the lumbering YB-40s would present themselves as isolated, slower-moving targets, ripe for exploitation. The hunter had become the hunted, not through a sudden ambush, but through the meticulous identification of an inherent, fatal flaw in their design. The initial encounters with the YB-40s were certainly perplexing for the Jagdflieger. Here were B-17s, but not as they knew them, bristling with an unprecedented array of defensive fire, seemingly impervious to conventional frontal assaults. Yet, the astute tactical observers within the Luftwaffe's ranks were quick to identify a critical operational constraint. They noted that after the main bomber stream had delivered its ordnance and lightened considerably, the heavily laden YB-40s struggled to maintain formation speed. This disparity in performance created a glaring tactical vulnerability. The German tactical analysts at the Reich's Luftfahrtministerium quickly seized upon this observation. A new directive was disseminated across fighter wings. Do not engage the YB-40s directly until the main bomber force has completed its attack run. Instead, conserve ammunition and fuel, shadowing the formations with patient aggression. Once the bomb bays emptied and the conventional B-17s surged forward, the lumbering YB-40s would present themselves as isolated, slower-moving targets, ripe for exploitation. The hunter had become the hunted, not through a sudden ambush, but through the meticulous identification of an inherent, fatal flaw in their design. The initial encounters with the YB-40s were certainly perplexing for the Jagdflieger. Here were B-17s, but not as they knew them, bristling with an unprecedented array of defensive fire, seemingly impervious to conventional frontal assaults. Yet, the astute tactical observers within the Luftwaffe's ranks were quick to identify a critical operational constraint. They noted that after the main bomber stream had delivered its ordnance and lightened considerably, the heavily laden YB-40s struggled to maintain formation speed. This disparity in performance created a glaring tactical vulnerability.
Luftwaffe Intelligence Units, meticulously analysierend Post-Mission Reconnaissance und Pilot Debriefs, swiftly kommunizierte dies Key-Observation up die Chain of Command. Any competent Luftwaffe commander would have immediately recognized these strategic implications. Der YB-40, designt zu einem formidablen Guardian zu werden, transformierte in eine Liability once its charges accelerated away. Die Direktive, das folgte, war unambiguous. Die YB-40s waren nunmehr mehrliche Targets auf Opportunität. Der waren Prioritätsobjekte, insbesondere während der Rückleg von einer Mission. Luftwaffe Fighter Groups, besonders die veteranen Jagdgeschwader, adaptierten ihre Taktiken mit brutaler Effizienz. Rand der Engagement der Entire-Bomber-Formation indiskriminiert, Piloten wurden instruiert zu konservieren Ammunition und positionieren sich für den opportunen Moment. Once der Bomberstream hat für heimgeturnt und der charakteristische Speed-Differenz emerged, die Hunt begann. Der slowere, einsamere YB-40s bekamen Stragglers von Virtua ihrer eigenen operationellen Design, präsentierten ein irisches Target. German Pilots, oft fliegende FW-190 oder Bf-109s, würden devastierende Attacken ausführen, fokussieren ihre konzentrierte Treffer auf diese laggenden Escorts. Die Heavy Armor und Increased Armament, das die YB-40 auszeichneten, wurden largely ineffektuell, wenn konfrontiert mit repetierten Sustained-Attacken von multiplen Vektoren, besonders von Astern oder Abobe, wo ihre defensive Arcs meinte kompromittiert werden können von einem skillten Pilot. Dieses taktische Palette rapidierte die YB-40s, intendiert als Deterrenten, into Magnete für Destruktion, fundamental unterminieren ihre operationelle Purpose und beschleunigen ihre inevitable Witzug von aktiver Service. Die taktische Pivot bei der Luftwaffe war nicht mehr theoretisch. Its efficacy wurde brutal demonstriert in subsequenten Engagements. German Fighter Pilots, nun vollständig Cognites der YB-40s kritischen operationellen Schwierigkeiten, its reduced speed, limited range when laden with ammunition und inhärente Unfähigkeit zur Montaigne-Formation once the main bomber stream lighted its payload, begannen zu systematisch exploitieren diese Vulnerabilitäten. They no longer perceived the YB-40 als ein undifferenzierter B-17, als ein distinct vulnerabilis target, whose defensive capabilities rapidly diminished with distance from the primary formation. Luftwaffe-Fightergruppen, besonders die operierenden die formidablen Focke-Wulf FW-190 und Messerschmitt Bf-109, begannen explizit target diese over-encumbered Escorts once the primary bombing run was complete. Combat Reports von beiden Allied Aircrews und German Interception Units painted ein grimmes Bild. YB-40s, strugglend zu maintainen pace, frequent bekamen isolated stragglers. Ihre formidable defensive Armament rendert ineffektiv auf konzertierte Multi-Axis-Attacken. Für Beispiel, bei several Missionen in Late May und Early June 1943, inklusive Raiden auf industrielle Ziele näher Kiel und Bremen, multiple YB-40s wurden als schwer verletzt oder komplett verloren. Die Serienmodifikationen, intendierte zu Erhöhen ihres Überlebens, Heavy Armor und Increased Armament, burdenten sie, demütigenden ihre Agilität und Speed, dadurch transformierten sie in Prime Targets once separiert von ihren Charges.
German pilots developed refined tactics, executing rapide high-speed passes, oft von oben oder below, zu konzentrieren Feuer on kritische Areas, knowing dass die YB-40's bulk made sustained evasive maneuvers exceedingly difficult. These consistent attrition, coupled with irrefutable evidence from every combat patrol, definitively proved the YB-40's fundamentale lack of operational viability. What was conceived as a solution to reduce bomber losses was ironically contributing zu denen, creating inviting, vulnerable targets für die Luftwaffe. This period marked a clear tactical victory für die German Air Force, underscoring their capacity für adaptive combat doctrine und rapide exploitation of perceived enemy weaknesses. Faced with prohibitive conversion costs, insurmountable logistical complexities und damning combat reports, die YB-40-Programm wurde offiziell gecancelt im August 1943, less than 3 Monate nach es First Combat Deployment. Die Surviving Aircraft wurden schriftlich stripped von ihrem spezialisierten Equipment, relegiert zu Cargo- oder Trainingsrollen, ein stark Testament zu einem Konzept, das, despite its innovative intent, fehlte zu bestehen den Crucible des aeriellen Warfare. The operational failure der YB-40, while costly, yielded invaluable data für Allied engineers, lessons swiftly integrated into the next Iteration der Flying Fortress. Für die German Luftwaffe ein neues, far more formidableres Zuhalt war about zu emergen in den Scheiern over den Reich. Die B-17G, beginnend ihre Deployment in late 1943, war nicht mehr ein inkrementeller Upgrade. Es repräsentierte eine direkte taktische Reaktion auf die severe Attrition inflicted von German Fighter Units. Luftwaffe-Pilots, accustomed zu exploitieren den B-17s Forward Blindspots mit devastierenden Head-on-Attacken, wurden suddenly konfrontiert durch eine radikal alterte Defensive Armament.
Der most significant innovation war die Bendix Chin Turret, ein formidables Twin 50 Caliber Emplacement mounted direkt beneath der Bombardierstation. Diese Anlage, eine direkte Konsequenz der YB-40 Trials, eliminierte den Bombers most critical vulnerability, transformieren den previously inviting Frontal Attack in eine deadly gauntlet of concentrated fire. Compounding this, die B-17G auch featurete Staggered Waist Gun Positions, removieren die Spatial-Restriktionen, die hatten oft die Effektivität der dorsalen und ventralen Gunners in earlier Models. Dies erlaubte für weitere Felder von Feuer und größere defensive Abdeckung along der Bombers Flanks. Die taktische Implikationen waren immediate und severe für die German Jagdflieger. Reportes von Gruppenkommandeur und Staffelkapitän echoten ein unified Sentiment. Die B-17G war ein signifikant schwierigeres Target zu engage. Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn, ein Veteran von numerous B-17 Engagements, reportete in einem Debriefing: "They have learned from their mistakes. The nose of the fortress now spits fire as fiercely as its tail." Die Ironie war nicht verloren auf Luftwaffe-Intelligence-Analysten. Die Wehrtaktics, die sich so erfolgreich gegen den experimentellen YB-40 erwiesen hatten, identifizieren seine Vulnerabilitäten in Sustained Engagement und exploitieren seine reduzierte Performance, hatten indirekt den Allies mit der präzisen Tata-Aussatteln genug, um die Standard-Bombers-Defensen zu stärken. Die Luftwaffe hatte, in Effekt, partizipiert am Live-Fire-Testing, der die B-17G in einen noch deadlicheren Adversären gestaltete. Die taktische Imperativ für German Fighter Pilots shiftete einmal mehr, demanding neue Ansätze zu penetrieren die nun formidable Defensive Screens der B-17-Formationen. Die taktische Imperativ für German Fighter Pilots shiftete einmal mehr, demanding neue Ansätze zu penetrieren die nun formidable Defensive Screens der B-17-Formationen. Dies dramatische Evolution unterstreicht eine fundamentale Treue des aeriellen Konflikts über Europa. Es war ein unendliches, hochsteckendes Spiel des strategischen Schach. Jeder Move von einer Seite prompte ein Kontermove, eine technologische Adaption oder eine taktische Reevaluierung von der anderen Seite.
The YB-40, a short-lived, costly experiment, epitomized this relentless cycle. For the 8th Air Force, its operational failure was a bitter pill, leading to its swift withdrawal after only 3 months of combat deployment. Yet the data gleaned from its combat trials was invaluable. It unequivocally demonstrated the critical need for forward defensive armament and highlighted the vulnerabilities of the bomber stream to concentrated head-on attacks. This harsh lesson, learned through the loss of airframes and lives, directly informed the design modifications of the B-17G, transforming it into a far more resilient platform. For the Luftwaffe, the period of the YB-40's deployment represented a fleeting, tactical triumph. German pilots, through their aggressive and astute exploitation of the YB-40's speed disparity and subsequent isolation from the main bomber formations, had effectively neutralized a perceived threat. They had adapted their Zerstörer tactics, successfully targeting the slower, more heavily armed escorts. However, this success was paradoxical. Unbeknownst to them, their very efficiency in exposing the YB-40's flaws inadvertently accelerated the development and deployment of the B-17G. The intelligence they gathered, the vulnerabilities they highlighted, were precisely the data points Allied engineers needed to refine the Flying Fortress into its most robust iteration. Thus, the brief saga of the YB-40 serves as a powerful testament to the relentless pace of innovation and adaptation that defined World War II aerial combat. It was a crucible where engineering theory met operational reality, where tactical brilliance collided with unforeseen consequences. The Luftwaffe's temporary mastery over the YB-40 quickly gave way to the far more formidable challenge of the B-17G, compelling a rethink of fighter-bomber interception strategies once again. In the skies above Europe, victory was never final. It was merely a temporary advantage, awaiting the next technological leap or tactical innovation. The aerial chess match continued, with ever higher stakes and deadlier pieces.